Today we're setting up a fun spelling class. Let's see if Helen can quickly score this giant piece of cake. Annie hoped this would show Helen that imitating the correct gestures gets you what you want. As she moved on to teaching her the word doll, Helen reluctantly gave it a go, but after getting her doll, she quickly tossed Annie to the ground. What a little rascal. She quickly locked the room and yanked out the key, just as her brother barged in at dinner time. The couple realized that Annie was locked in the attic, and Mom couldn't find the keys anywhere on Helen, so Dad had to use the blanket to pull Annie down from the window, and once everyone left, Annie sneaked up behind Helen, wondering what tricks this little troublemaker would pull next. Helen felt around, confirmed no one was there, and triumphantly pulled the key from her mouth. This proved Helen was mentally fine, but Annie struggled to discipline her without hurting her feelings, so she wrote to the principal for help. At that moment, sneaky Helen accidentally knocked over the ink on the table. While Annie cleaned it up, she used the opportunity to teach her how. They held hands trying to write together, but when Helen accidentally poked herself with the pen, she flipped out and started destroying her doll. After Annie stopped the chaos, a furious Helen chucked a vase across the room, and Mom rushed in, cleaning up while saying, "Helen's dad thinks teaching her to spell is like playing piano for a cow." He firmly declared, "As long as she learns enough words, she'll understand someday." With that, Annie gently touched Helen's hand, and she quickly started to recall. However, while they were chatting, Helen suddenly jabbed Annie with the pen. Mom quickly pulled her away, only making Helen even more upset. To calm her down, Mom shoved a piece of candy in Helen's mouth, leaving Annie utterly baffled. Finally, Annie realized. This was why Helen's outbursts were so rewarded. And the affection that Helen's family holds for her extends far beyond just one candy. It's much more than that. At breakfast the next day, everyone sat politely while Helen was running around the table, bizarrely reaching for everyone's food. That led to the opening scene, and Shed finally learned what compliance meant, but her dad thought Anna's methods were too rough, and decided to fire her, but thankfully his wife stepped in to stop him. However, after this, Helen resisted Anna's contact, making Dad angrier at the teacher. That night, he told Annie to change her teaching attitude and show more compassion if she wanted to stay. Annie immediately rebutted, saying, "It's your backing that made Helen so unruly." To her, the biggest hurdle to Helen's growth was never her blindness or deafness, but your limitless spoiling. With that, she took the couple to a nearby abandoned cabin, suggesting they must educate Helen here alone. This way they could see their daughter every day, and Helen would lose the protection of her parents. Ultimately, the husband compromised. He agreed to grant Annie 2 final weeks for improvement. However, if Helen hadn't changed by then, Annie would have to pack her belongings and leave. The following morning, servants cleaned the cabin spotless. When Helen's brother showed up with luggage, he jokingly asked, "Are you planning to tie Helen to a chair for your lesson?" Seeing Anna's serious expression, his smile faded, and he earnestly asked, "Why do you show Helen no sympathy at all?" Anna's words made her brother understand her teaching philosophy. Meanwhile, the parents took Helen on a 2-hour detour to the cabin. When Helen cautiously entered, she realized she was in an entirely unfamiliar place, and she started to panic while frantically calling for her. Mom instinctively wanted to comfort her, but Annie stopped her. Despite her deep reluctance for Helen's growth, the parents had to leave painfully while Helen groped in the cabin for them. She finally touched her hand, but it turned out to be the one person she disliked the most, Annie. Now Helen understood that her parents had purposely left her here, so she began rampaging through the room, venting her unease and dissatisfaction. But that couldn't change the inevitable. She eventually crawled under the bed. After a whole day without food, Annie worried that she might starve, so she had to wake up the servant, a guy named Black. When she felt Black's warm hand, Annie finally sighed in relief, but Helen still had a strong resistance to her teacher. Which is why Annie decided to teach Black to sign cake, hoping he would help teach Helen too. Just then, Helen came over, and upon seeing them signing, she immediately spelled cake on Black's hand. Seeing that she spelled it right, Annie immediately presented her with a piece of cake. Helen finally understood that if she signed like Annie taught her, she could score some food. However, at that moment, She still didn't grasp the deeper meaning behind it, and she continued teaching Black other words. She shoved disruptive Helen aside, sparking her jealousy. Helen snatched Black's hand, learning actively, thrilling Annie. When Helen successfully spelled milk, Annie quickly brought her some milk content after eating. Helen happily crawled into bed and drifted off to dreamland. To help Helen better experience the world, Annie decided field walks with her near the cool riverside, and sometimes let her smell the flowers and feel the joy of baby birds hatching. In the blink of an eye, almost 2 weeks had passed, and Mom couldn't hold back any longer. When she came to check on them, she discovered that her daughter had not only learned to but even became polite during meals. Seeing her daughter's changes filled Mom with joy, but Annie felt this was still not enough. Insisting she needed more time to teach Helen, which made the mother, who missed her daughter dearly, find it hard to accept. Next, Annie had to race against time, drilling Helen on previously learned words, and Helen was so dedicated she even signed unconsciously in her sleep. But she still couldn't grasp the true meanings of the words, and often confused some of them. No matter how Annie corrected, it was futile. On the last day, Dad sent a dog as a graduation gift, but Annie wanted another week. But Dad thought it was already great that his daughter was behaving, so he ultimately refused. In the end, he said Helen could stay until 5 in the afternoon, and upon returning to the house, Annie hurriedly tried to teach Helen the word dog. But Helen still couldn't grasp